Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936 after more than a century of social, economic, and political division. 500,000 people died in this conflict between 1936 and 1939. In the 19th century, Spain had struggled between periods of conservatism and liberalism. There were several issues that caused tension and division in Spain in the century before 1930s, fractures that were to become more acute in the decade before the Civil War broke out. A civil war is not a war but a sickness. The enemy is within. One fights almost against oneself. Yet Spain's tragedy in 1936 was even greater. It had become enmeshed in the international civil war, which started in earnest with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. These are the long-term and short-term causes, which we'll go over in depth. First of all, the weakness of the government, the role of Spanish army, the role of Catholic Church, political opposition in the fall of the monarchy, and the establishment of the Second Republic. Short-term causes are all about political polarization. Paul Preston, a foremost historian of the Spanish Civil War, wrote in 1991, "The consequence was, at a very superficial level, political stability, but beneath it, tremendous social instability, because nothing really ever changed. Elections changed virtually nothing. Only a relatively small portion of the electorate had the right to vote, and since nothing changed, the population was forced into apathy or violent opposition to the system." And here are the long-term causes. From 1871, Spain had been a constitutional monarchy. The king was head of state, and he appointed a prime minister who should have commanded a majority in parliament, or the Cortes. Yet although the Cortes was elected by male population, real power was held by the wealthy oligarchs, and political control shifted between their different cliques. There were two main parties, the conservatives and the liberals, but in fact there was no real difference between them. Elections were rigged or decided by corruption. There were no mass democratic political parties. The army had a powerful position in Spain due to its role in Spain's imperial past. It believed that it was the protector of the nation, and that this meant it had the right and duty to intervene in politics if a crisis occurred. It had intervened in this way several times in 1820, 1871, and 1923. However, it did not act to save the king in 1931, and this led to his exile. The army intervened again during the Second Republic and lastly in 1936. It was this last intervention that was to lead to a civil war. The army wasn't popular with the people. It had a reputation for brutality. It was expensive and required heavy taxes to maintain. The army was also proved ineffective when it lost the Spanish Empire during the 19th century and lost the war with America in 1898. It had also struggled to keep control of Morocco between 1906 and 1926. The army was in need of reform. It was too big and had too many officers. The upper and middle classes, however, defended their interests as they dominated the officer corps. The army was generally conservative, but the Africanistas, those who were experienced in the wars in Morocco, were the most traditional and nationalistic. The Catholic Church was rich and powerful in Spain, and there had been a dispute between the church and state throughout the 19th century. The state had guaranteed the role of church in education and in elements of the economy, and the church had used its wealth to gain considerable political and social influence. It used its power to support social and political and economic conservatism and was opposed to modernizing and liberal forces. The aristocracy was closely tied to the church. They made up the vast majority of senior clergy and provided much of the funding for the church. This meant the church was inclined to defend the rights and status of the upper classes, which led to resentment amongst the poor. In many urban areas, there were protests against the church, although it was more popular in rural areas. The plight of the agricultural workers was a key factor in the discontent that led to the Civil War. Spain was mainly an agricultural economy, and agriculture was the main source of employment. Unfortunately, there were fundamental problems that made it inefficient. It did not provide sufficient food, and work was only seasonal. There was a need for workers to migrate in search of work. Most lived in abject poverty, and the gap between rich and poor was vast. Rioting and disorder often broke out in the countryside. The civil guard were deployed to ruthlessly repress any disorder. With no support from the church, some looked to groups such as anarchists, who argued for the redistribution of land. Yet many Catholic small landowners were very conservative and resistant to social and anarchist ideas. The conservatism was exploited by the Catholic Agrarian Federation, which provided support for farmers in return for their rejection of socialist ideas. These same farmers were later to support Franco and to fight on his side during the war. Industrially, there was also the need for modernization and reform. Apart from the North, there had been little Spanish industrialization in the 19th century. Expansion was limited by endemic poverty. Workers in towns, meanwhile, faced low wages, long hours, unregulated working conditions, poor housing, and little in the way of welfare provision. This situation led to the growth of trade unionism. Spain's neutrality during World War I facilitated a short period of economic boom. With this increase of exports, however, there was also inflation and shortages. Working-class living standards went down and working-class militancy increased. By the early 1920s, there were major economic problems, and this led to violent conflict between employers and employees, particularly in the industrial cities in Catalonia. A significant cause of tension was the ongoing struggle between the centralist state and Catalonia and the Basque provinces, which wanted decentralization and independence. The Catalans and the Basque had their own separate languages and cultures, and by the early 20th century, they had their own industrialized economies and churches. In the 1920s, the Prime Minister, Primo de Rivera, took back the self-governing rights of the Catalonia, and these separatist forces supported the Republican movement that overthrew Alfonso in 1931. De Rivera was an experienced military official before becoming prime minister in 1923. He ruled Spain as a dictator until 1930. There were a number of groups opposed to the political status quo in Spain, and each would play a part in the political divisions that led to violent conflict in 1936. The liberal movement in Spain had achieved little in opposing conservative forces in the 19th century, although they remained a political force and supported the revolution that overthrew the king in 1931. The PSOE, or Spanish Socialist Party, had grown in urban areas in the late 19th century but had minimal impact, whereas the UGT, another socialist party, was more visible in organizing strikes and protests in urban regions. In addition, following the Bolshevik Revolution, a small communist party emerged. The socialists, as with the liberals, played a significant role in the revolution of 1931, but the parties became divided over what reforms should take place. The more moderate socialists were led by Indelicio Prieto, and the radicals were led by Largo Caballero. The anarchists were also a major group in Spain. Also previously suggested, this was mainly due to their demand for the redistribution of land, which was popular with the peasants. The anarchists argued for revolutionary methods and boycotted all democratic processes. Their trade union was the CNT, which, like the UGT, was active in organizing strikes and protests. In addition, there were a more extreme anarchist faction called the FAI, or Spanish Anarchist Federation, which perpetrated bombings and assassinations. Oh, that was hard, kids. So here's a chart of the different political parties, starting with our furthest from the left, or their furthest to the left, which is our anarchists, who wanted radical social reform. Burn it down is what they thought. Then you get your center-left socialists that wanted social reforms to achieve greater fairness and distribution of wealth. Nothing radical, of course, but not too radical, as we're going to see is with the anarchists. Then you get the center, and they wanted moderate reforms. They thought, in time, but they moved increasingly right as our center left took over. Our center right defended the social hierarchy and religion, and they had commitments to democracy, kind of, maybe, not really. We get our right. These are our fascists, and even these will become even further to the right here under Franco. And then our separatist party, both Catalonian and Basque, they did not work together, rather worked for their own rights. And then Carlism, Wikipedia that. It is so fascinating. It's still an issue in Spain today. And this is traditionalists that sought a different heir to the Bourbon dynasty in 1831. They argued for Salic law in which no woman could inherit. And instead, what happened was a woman did inherit. And they've been fighting their claim ever since. King Alfonso XIII was not a modernizer. The impact of military defeat in Morocco and post-World War I depression put pressure on the king. And after 12 unsuccessful governments during the period of 1819 to 1923, Alfonso did not resist the coup of General Primo de Rivera in 1923. De Rivera tried to establish an authoritarian right-wing regime to redress Spain's problems, similar to the Italian fascist model. He started various infrastructure programs for railways, roads, and electrification, as well as irrigation schemes. Industrial production developed at 3 times the rate of output before 1923, and he ended the war in Morocco in 1925. Nevertheless, he ran up massive debts that put Spain into a dreadful situation when Wall Street crash came. He managed to alienate most of the powerful elements of society, including the landowners and the army. Thus, de Rivera resigned in 1930, having not resolved Spain's economic problems or brought about long-term political stability. It seemed that a dictatorship was not Spain's solution for problems. After municipal elections in April showed support for the San Sebastian Pact coalition of parties, the king went into voluntary exile. This time, neither the church nor the army intervened to save the king. Yet there seemed nothing they could put in his place. A velvet revolution had occurred, and the Second Republic was established. As a result of all of this going on in the 1920s, the failed dictatorship, the economic problems, the Wall Street crash, which led to a Great Depression, you get the number one cause, short-term cause, of the Spanish Civil War, and that is political polarization. In the elections that followed Alfonso's departure, the center-left won with the objective of modernizing Spain. The government declared a new constitution stating that Spain was a democratic republic of workers of all classes. Manuel Azana became the president and leading figure in the new regime. However, the key issues causing tension in Spain before the Velvet Revolution of 1931 continued to dominate the political, economic, and social atmosphere under the new left-wing government. Azana addressed the issue of the church's power. His speeches were anti-clerical, and an attempt was made to separate the church and state and to limit church powers. The church was no longer in control of education, and the state payment of clergy was to be stopped gradually over a 2-year period. The power of the army was also attacked. The government attempted to reduce numbers by offering early retirement on full pay, an offer taken by 50% of the officers. Also, the military academy, the one that Franco actually graduated from, was closed. Yet this policy backfired to a certain extent, as not only was it expensive for the government, but it meant that the army was radicalized. Those who remained in the army were the conservative and nationalist corps, including the Africanistas. The desperate economic problems that existed in Spain had been exacerbated by the Depression. Agricultural prices were tumbling, wine and olive exports fell, and land had gone out of cultivation. Peasant unemployment was rising too. The effects were also being felt industrially. Iron production fell by 1/3 and steel by almost 1/2. Largo Caballero was the Minister of Labor, and he initiated an expensive land redistribution program which had compensation for landowners. In 1932, a law enabled the state to take control over estates and to give that land to the peasants. Yet the government did not have the money for this change, and fewer than 7,000 families had benefited from the program by 1933. The right also saw this as a major threat to its interests and an attempt to copy the Soviet system. The desperate economic problems that existed in Spain had been exacerbated by the Depression. Agricultural prices were tumbling, and wine and olive exports fell, and land had gone out of cultivation. Peasant unemployment was rising. The effects were also being felt industrially. Iron production fell by nearly 1/3 and steel by 1/2. They tried a law that enabled the state to take over estates and redistribute that land to peasants, yet the government did not have the money to compensate the landowners, and fewer than 7,000 families had benefited from the program by 1933. The right saw this as a major threat to its interest and an attempt to copy the Soviet system. Civil unrest and violence continued under the Left Republic. It dealt with its perpetrators brutally. The government introduced the assault guard in an attempt to produce a more left-wing military force. There were uprisings by both the right against the reforms and the left against the slow pace of change. At this time, the risings were suppressed as the majority of the army remained loyal. As for regional issues, Catalonia was given its own parliament and some powers, including law and order and dual control over education. Right-wing groups were angered by this change as they saw it as a move towards independence for the regions and the breakup of Spain. Each reform was perceived as an attack on one or more right-wing groups, either the church, army, the landowners, or the industrialists. A new right-wing party called the CEDA, or Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rights, was formed to defend the church and lands. It was modeled on the German Nazi Party. Indeed, the political divisions within Spain seemed to increase under the Second Republic. The right wing opposed the reforms, sometimes with violence. Although some historians see the failure of land reform as central to the failure of the government during this period, historian Paul Preston has argued that the right wing was never going to give this regime a chance. Azana himself did himself a major disservice in January 1933 when he ordered a group of anarchists to be smoked out. 25 people were killed. This incident lost the left-wing republic its support of the working class. The elections of 1933 saw the republic swing to the right, with the right-wing and central parties benefiting from the disunity of the left. Although the CEDA was the largest party, the president resisted giving Gil Robles power. However, CEDA forced the government's hand in October 1934 by withdrawing support. Gil Robles was made war minister, and 2 other CEDA party members were given cabinet posts. The new government ruled for 2 years in what became known as the Black Years, because they embarked on systematically reversing the Left Republic's reforms. Church control was restored over education, and the clergy were again to be paid by the state. Azuna's key economic reform, the land program, was halted. Catalonia attempted to resist interference and declared itself independent after the CEDA joined the government. Its autonomy was suspended after the Asturian miners' uprising in 1934. This rebellion was put down by troops, including Moroccan forces, or the Africanistas. Threats from the left of a general strike increased. Historians have argued that the violent suppression of this uprising increased the likelihood of civil war in Spain. In addition, the right lost the support of the Basque, who now backed the left wing. Violence was widespread. The political response to the right-wing republic was divided. Caballero was more extreme in his speeches than the more moderate Prieto. He suggested that the CEDA was a Spanish Nazi party and that the left should seek a Soviet-style solution for Spain. Thus, he articulated the parallels in Spanish politics to the broader European political landscape. In response, Gil Robles demanded a shift to a more authoritarian approach to control the communists in Spain. This response led to more cooperation between the left's factions, the socialists, the anarchists, the syndicates, and now the communists. Indeed, Prieto attempted to find some common ground between the left and center groups to enable them to take on the right wing. The right wing disintegrated as the economic and the political situation deteriorated. And in the elections of February 1936, the Popular Front, which was an anti-fascist pact made up of various left-wing groups, including the socialists and the communists, was victorious. However, here was the same policy that was being advocated by Stalin in the Soviet Union in his Popular Front policy from 1935. Thus, while some people saw the Popular Front as a final attempt to uphold democracy, others associated it with Stalin and the more extreme communist supporters. The manifesto promoted by President Azana, who is now returned to power, was liberal and not radical. Nevertheless, the government wanted to restore the reforms of the 1931-33 government, and political prisoners were released. But there was still no political consensus. Caballero's socialists did not join the government, and the right would not accept the restoration of the reforms. The anarchists encouraged peasants to seize land, which led to an increase in violence in the countryside. They also openly recruited for their militias and organized bombings and assassinations. Open conflict between the anarchist FAI and the fascist CEDA and Falange youth groups increased. The government again faced increasing disorder. In May, the CNT called for a general strike, and there were several strikes throughout June. The right wing believed that Spain was in the early throes of a left-wing revolution. The victory of the left in the 1936 elections threw the right-wing CEDA into turmoil. Gil Robles began to use his funds to support military plans for a coup. In fact, military officers began planning for a coup as soon as the Popular Front gained power. An extreme nationalist group of junior officers joined with the senior Africanista officers, including Mola and Franco. And the catalyst for the coup was the murder of a popular CEDA leader on July 13, 1936. Azana knew that there were plans for a coup and attempted to prevent it by moving key military figures to remote posts. However, they had already made their plans and set a date for the coup, July 18, 1936. The conspirators made contact with the fascist Falange groups and the monarchist Carlist group. Spain was clearly polarized between groups inspired by the Soviets, who feared the fascists, and the right, which was inspired by Hitler and Mussolini and feared the communists. When details of the coup were discovered, the coup was initiated earlier on July 17th from Morocco. It spread to the mainland and was successful in taking northern Spain and parts of Andalusia in the south. Yet the rising failed in the main industrial areas, and rebels did not take Madrid. Half the army had remained loyal to the Republic. Thus the coup overall was unsuccessful, and had it remained a Spanish affair, it is quite possible that the Republicans would have won. And now the Civil War begins with Republicans on the left versus the Nationalists on the right. Each side will abandon democracy for civil war. As one historian, Anthony Beaver, wrote in The Battle for Spain, the Spanish Civil War, in 2006, he said, when considering which side, the right or left, can be held responsible for causing the Civil War, the debate often focuses on which side departed from democratic and legal means first. The socialists are held responsible by some for refusing to join the Popular Front government, which in turn concerned the right. They thought this could be because the socialists were now intent on revolution. The right then planned the coup to prevent this. In terms of which side resorted to violence first, it could be viewed as the left in attempting to seize power in the Asturian Rising, but the right had attempted this earlier in 1932. In the end, most historians argue that it was the right's coup that triggered the general conflict.